You ever get that feeling like the world's just spinning way too fast?
Oh, definitely.
And you just wish you had a way to make sense of the big picture without getting totally lost in the daily headlines and the chaos.
Absolutely.
Well, that's pretty much the deep dive in a nutshell, learner. It's your way to sort of understand the forces really shaping our world. And today, we think we've got a really powerful lens for you.
We do indeed. We're diving into the framework of Ray Dalio. I mean, he's a huge name in global investing, right?
Steve Jobs of investing, they call him.
Exactly. And we're focusing on his book, Principles for Dealing with the New World Order: Why Countries Succeed and Fail. You can think of it as like a historical X-ray for understanding what's happening right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. So Dalio, he's drawing on, decades of experience in the global economy?
Right, decades.
And he stepped back to find these repeating patterns all through history.
Yeah, he's essentially trying to build a kind of predictive map based on how nations have succeeded and failed over centuries.
So our mission here in this deep dive is to pull out those key insights, the why behind all these economic and social shifts.
Exactly. So you, the learner, can get a clearer handle on our current moment and maybe even, get a sense of what might be coming next.
Okay. So where do we start? What's the first big idea?
Right. Well, the core concept is what he calls the Great Cycle.
The Great Cycle.
Yeah. Imagine like a rhythm, maybe roughly 100 years long in a country's life story. A big wave with smaller ups and downs inside it.
Okay.
And what's really interesting, learner, is how he sees it. It includes the good times, peace, creativity.
Good stuff we like to remember.
Right. But it also includes the downturns, the periods of depression, revolution, even war.
And it's not just good times and bad times, is it? He sees it more like a process.
Exactly. More like a fundamental evolutionary process.
Huh.
So while those tough periods, depression, war, are obviously incredibly difficult for people living through them,
Yeah, devastating.
Dalio argues they often serve this crucial evolutionary purpose. Think of it like a reset.
A reset button.
Pretty much. These intense times can clear out the weaknesses, the excesses that build up, like way too much debt, for example.
Okay.
And that clearing out, it ultimately paves the way for a fresh start, maybe a stronger foundation. It's disruptive, definitely, but historically, it often leads to a whole new world order.
So something new grows from the wreckage. Now, he also mentioned smaller cycles within this big one. Debt cycles, maybe?
Yes, exactly. He talks about long-term debt cycles. These can stretch out maybe 50 to 100 years, and they often fuel those really big booms and busts.
Okay.
And then there are the shorter-term debt cycles, more like 8 to 10 years, maybe. Those are the familiar economic expansions and recessions we hear about more often.
Got it.
But a key point Dalio really stresses, and this is super important for you to think about, learner, is just how humans tend to think. We assume tomorrow will be, basically like yesterday, just tweaked a bit.
Yeah, we get stuck in the recent past, anchored.
Precisely. So unless you actively go back and study these patterns over, like many generations, you're probably going to miss these huge swings, the massive booms and collapses that have happened again and again.
Right.
Dalio even shares this personal aha moment he had that really brought it home for him.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
It was back in 1971, Nixon's announcement. The U.S. saying it wouldn't convert dollars to gold anymore.
Ah, the end of Bretton Woods as it was.
Exactly. For Dalio, that was like an earthquake. It made him realize the whole foundation of the money system he knew was actually changing right then and there.
Wow.
And that specific event pushed him to really dig into the history. Currency devaluations, why dominant countries rise and fall. It was a wake-up call to look way beyond the immediate headlines.
That really forces you to zoom out, doesn't it? And this connects directly to the whole idea of a reserve currency, right? That's critical.
It absolutely does. So a reserve currency, as Dalio lays it out, is basically a currency that's accepted everywhere globally for trade, and also as a place for countries and big investors to park their savings safely.
Okay.
And the country that issues that main reserve currency, which right now is the U.S. dollar, of course, holds significant power. A lot of international debt gets written in that currency. It's like the bedrock of the global financial system.
But like you said, with the cycles, that kind of dominance doesn't last forever.
That's the crucial historical point. Every single reserve currency in history has eventually lost that top spot. Everyone.
Really? Every single one.
Yep. And those transitions, when a currency loses its status, they've often been pretty traumatic, very difficult times for the countries involved.
I bet.
So this leads Dalio to ask these really big questions. When, and maybe why, might the US dollar lose its #1 status? What could possibly replace it? And, how would that fundamentally change everything, the whole world order we live in?
Hey, those are enormous questions. Huge. So how does someone like Dalio even start to tackle that? What's his research method like?
Well, he calls it an iterative research process. It sounds pretty intense, actually.
Iterative, meaning what?
Imagine like a loop, right? He does deep research, writes down what he finds, and then this is key, he goes out and seeks feedback from top experts, historians, policymakers all over the world, people who will really challenge his ideas.
So he wants people to poke holes in it.
Exactly. He analyzes their critiques, refines his thinking, rewrites, retests the model against more history, and he just keeps doing that again and again until he feels he's got a really solid understanding.
Wow, that sounds incredibly thorough, almost like a scientific approach to history.
In a way, yeah, and the scope is massive. He looked at 11 major empires over the last 500 years,
Okay.
the top 20 countries over the last century, and major Chinese dynasties stretching 1,400 years.
1,400 years.
Yeah. Now, he's upfront about limitations, He acknowledges he has less data or focus on, say, empires in Africa or South Asia or pre-colonial America.
Right.
But even with those gaps, he believes he's found these fundamental recurring patterns in how nations rise and eventually fall.
And it's not just about numbers, right? He mixes quantitative stuff with, qualitative understanding.
Precisely. He really emphasizes measuring things, economic conditions, social factors, how they change to spot these cause and effect links. That helps build probabilities about the future.
Makes sense.
But he also knows, look, not everything important can be neatly measured. So his process involves really digging into numerous historical case studies to grasp how different factors interacted to cause specific outcomes. He uses a simple example. You get high debt, plus money becomes scarce.
You get a debt crisis.
Typically, yeah. That's a common pattern.
Okay. And how do these different cycles, like the debt cycle and maybe social unrest, how do they interact to signal trouble for a leading power?
Well, he points to this dangerous combination, like a negative synergy, when major cycles align badly.
What a perfect storm.
Kind of, yeah. So imagine high debt levels, plus the central bank is printing a lot of money, plus you have growing internal conflict, maybe big wealth gaps or deep political divides. That creates a really volatile situation internally. And if that happens at the same time as one or more foreign powers are rising and actively challenging the established leader, well, historically, that's often been a sign that the dominant empire's influence is starting to decline.
Okay, that combination sounds concerning. So we have these big cycles. What are the specific things, the levers, that Dalio says really determine a country's wealth and power?
He boils it down to 8 key determinants. You ready?
Lay 'em on me.
Okay. Number 1, education quality. 2, competitiveness, like how productive and cost-effective it is. 3, innovation and technology. 4, economic output, overall GDP. 5, how much it participates in world trade. 6, military strength. 7, its power as a financial center. And number 8, that reserve currency status we talked about.
And I'm guessing these aren't separate things. They all kind of link together.
Absolutely. That's a key finding. They tend to rise and fall together, reinforcing each other. Like good education often sparks more innovation.
Which leads to better trade.
Stronger military, bigger economy, more powerful financial center. The whole package. It can be a virtuous cycle going up or, well, a vicious cycle going down.
Like a flywheel, spinning faster or slower. Okay. So based on these factors and the great cycle, does Dalio see a kind of typical story, an archetype, for how this rise and fall usually happens?
He does. He outlines 3 general phases in this sort of archetypal great cycle. Phase 1 he calls the Age, which is German for peak, but think of it as the boom or the rise.
The good times.
Yeah, this is the prosperity phase that comes after a new world order is set up. Countries here usually have low debt, wealth gaps aren't too extreme, people cooperate more, education and infrastructure are strong, leadership is capable, and it's generally a peaceful time globally, often with one dominant power-keeping order.
Sounds ideal. What happens next?
Then comes phase 2, deterioration. This is where you start seeing problems creep in. Wealth and power gaps get wider. Debt starts to climb.
Especially if you have that reserve currency,
Well,
right? It makes it easy to borrow.
Exactly, that exorbitant privilege, as it's called.
Yeah.
You also see more political infighting, maybe education and infrastructure start to slide a bit, and importantly, external rivals start getting stronger and challenging the status quo.
Okay, things are getting shaky. And the final phase.
The final phase is Depression-Revolution War. This is where those underlying tensions over wealth, power, values just explode. It often leads to major conflict, either internally, like a revolution or civil war, or externally, like a major war between powers.
Yeah.
And these events cause huge shifts. They basically realign the world order to match the new reality of who actually holds the power. The cycle kind of ends when people lose faith in the declining empire's money and its debt, and they start moving away from them.
It's a full circle. But Dalio does say that underneath all this cycling, there's been overall progress, yeah.
Like things generally get better over the very long term.
He does stress that. He shows charts demonstrating that despite these cycles, the long-term trend for things like productivity, technology, and overall living standards has been upward throughout history. Humanity adapts, innovates.
So the cycles are like big bumps on an upward sloping road.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
But he also emphasizes that for the people living through those bumps, those downturns, they can be incredibly painful and destructive. They aren't just abstract fluctuations on a chart.
And he uses the 1930s and 40s as a prime example, doesn't he?
Exactly. The Great Depression, World War II. He points out, the U.S. stock market crashed something like 85% before it recovered. Global economic activity shrank massively.
And he explains how these periods often involve huge credit problems because of too much debt. What happens then? Central banks often step in and print money, extend credit, try to paper over the cracks.
Like we saw in 2008.
And with COVID.
Precisely. He sees echoes of the 1930s response in those more recent events.
And these times of crisis, they don't just affect the economy, right? They shake up society, too.
Oh, absolutely. Dalio notes that big wealth gaps and the conflict they cause during these downturns often lead to really fundamental changes. New social programs, different economic systems being debated. Capitalism versus communism was a huge one. Then massive shifts in who holds wealth and power.
And sometimes it's not just economic or political, right? Nature plays a role.
Yeah, he mentions things like the Dust Bowl drought in the U.S. in the 30s, how that made a terrible situation even worse. At the end of the day, these struggles, internal and external, they decide who's in charge, leading to a new internal system and a new global order like the one that emerged after 1945. Which brings us, I guess, to the big question for you, the learner listening right now. Where does Dalio think we are today in this whole historical sweep?
Right. Well, he notes that the last major period of, let's call it destruction and rebuilding, was that 1930-1945 period. That led to the post-1945 world order.
With the U.S. dominant.
Exactly. The Bretton Woods monetary system, the UN in New York, the World Bank and IMF in Washington. Clear signs of U.S. leadership.
And that was, what, about 75, almost 80 years ago now?
Exactly. And if you look at history, empires with the reserve currency often hit the later stages of their big debt cycles around this point. They've accumulated huge debts and obligations. Maybe their usual tools, like just cutting interest rates, aren't working so well anymore.
Okay.
So he describes our current situation as having several key features. Political fragmentation, lots of internal fighting, governments borrowing heavily, pushing central banks to print money, big gaps in wealth and also in core values, and a rising power China challenging the established power the U.S. on many fronts. Plus, we had the whole COVID pandemic shaking things up further.
So it definitely sounds like a potentially critical point in the cycle, based on his model.
Yeah.
Now, he goes deeper than those 8 determinants. He has a list of 18 factors, right? Can you give us a couple of interesting ones from that longer list?
Sure. One that's interesting is geology, basically. Natural resources. Obviously important, right?
Yeah, oil, minerals.
But Dalio argues their real value, adjusted for inflation, tends to decrease over the long run. Why? Because we innovate, find substitutes, or just use them up. And he points out how countries that rely too much on just one or two resources, like oil, can be really vulnerable to price swings.
That makes sense. What's another one?
Natural phenomena. Think big picture here. Diseases, floods, droughts. Historically, he says, these have often had bigger impacts than wars or depression.
Really? Bigger than wars?
Sometimes, yeah. Think about the Black Death in Europe or smallpox devastating Native American populations. These things can reshape societies completely.
Wow. Those are sobering examples. What about factors within society?
Well, he looks at class struggle. Basically, how much conflict is there between different economic groups? He observed there's usually more harmony when the economy's booming, but conflict ramps up during downturns, and that really affects internal stability.
Okay.
Then there's the left-right political cycle. These swings back and forth in how wealth and power get distributed, often driven by the bigger great cycle and those wealth gaps we mentioned. Big economic crises can sometimes trigger major political shifts, even revolutions.
Right.
And one more, kind of fascinating. The multi-generational psychological cycle, the idea that societies kind of go through stages, like starting from hardship and struggle, building up wealth, and becoming comfortable, maybe too comfortable.
Complacent.
Yeah, complacent. And then the cracks start showing, the gaps widen, and people start facing the reality that things might be declining, that the initial drive isn't there anymore.
That psychological angle over generations is really intriguing. Now, zooming in on the U.S. today, Dalio puts it in a specific phase, stage 5, right? What does that look like?
Right. So in his model of the internal order cycle, he assesses the U.S. as being in stage 5. This is a stage where financial conditions are generally bad, maybe getting worse, and internal conflict is intensifying.
But the country still has strengths.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Significant strengths, technology, military, but the relative trend is one of decline in those strengths compared to rivals. Stage 5 typically comes after periods of spending too much, racking up debt, and seeing those wealth and political gaps widen. But it's before things totally break down into, say, revolution or civil war.
And he talks about the media's role in stage 5. It sounds pretty negative.
It does. He observes this intense battle to control information, to sway public opinion, gain support, and really tear down the opposition. He uses the term vigilantes to describe how some media outlets on both sides might act, fueling blame, destroying reputations quickly, maybe without much due process.
Kind of like propaganda machines.
He draws parallels to the 1930s, when populist movements often use media that way. And a big consequence, he warns, is that truth itself gets harder to find in the public square. And capable people might become afraid to speak out or run for office because they fear being attacked.
That sounds like a really toxic environment. How is stage 5 different from the next stage, stage 6? That sounds much worse.
Stage 6 is, it's civil war or revolution. It's when the system fundamentally breaks down. The government loses control and violence becomes a primary way to settle disputes.
Okay.
Revolutionary change tries to completely remake the system. It often involves violence, like civil wars, though he notes peaceful transitions can happen, just less commonly in this stage historically. These periods are typically brutal. Violence escalates as sides get desperate, and often elites or moderates try to flee, but even that is risky.
A very grim picture.
Yeah.
What about the external side? How do nations interact when they're in these later stages?
Dalio basically says the external struggles are driven by the same fundamental things: the desire for wealth and power. And military strength is always tied to economic strength. You need money to build and maintain a powerful military and to pay for things at home.
So if a country gets weaker economically,
it becomes more vulnerable, both to internal unrest and to challenges from those rising external powers we talked about.
Okay, so putting this all together, what's Dalio's snapshot view of the U.S. versus China right now using this framework?
Well, in his simplified take, he sees the U.S. currently in that tricky stage 5 of its internal cycle.
Okay. Deteriorating finances, rising conflict.
Right. Whereas he views China as being more in stage 3. That's the phase associated more with peace, building prosperity, increasing strength.
Wow, that's a big difference in stages.
It is. And he argues these different stages profoundly affect how the two countries relate to each other and shapes the whole global order.
He also mentioned different leadership styles are needed for different stages. That was interesting.
Yeah, I thought so too. He talks about stage 3 leaders often being like civil engineers. Their focus is designing and building productive systems, making things work efficiently. He contrasts that with the inspiring generals, maybe needed more in the chaotic stage 6 or the rebuilding stage 1.
Can you give examples of those civil engineer types?
He mentions people like Konrad Adenauer in post-war Germany, Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, Deng Xiaoping in China leaders who really oversaw massive national development and building phases.
Right. And for the U.S. in stage 5, what does that look like on the ground?
Well, he points again to those widening wealth and political gaps driving more conflict. He even uses his own state, Connecticut, as an example of seeing these divides play out locally.
And didn't he cite a really worrying statistic about polarization?
He did. It was quite shocking, actually. A survey suggesting a significant percentage of both Republicans and Democrats felt the country would be better off if a large number of the other party just died.
Wow. That's extreme.
It really highlights the level of animosity. Now, Dalio does acknowledge that the U.S. constitutional system provides a strong, durable framework. It has resilience.
Yeah.
But that very durability means if it were to break down, it could be even more traumatic than in systems with less history of stability. He warns to watch for signs like people ignoring rules, resorting to emotional attacks instead of debate, and, crucially, any move towards actual bloodshed to settle scores. Those are red flags for escalation.
Okay, let's dig into the U.S.-China relationship more specifically. Dalio talks about 5 kinds of wars happening between them now. What are they?
Right, he identifies 5 main arenas of competition, which he frames as types of wars. First, the obvious one, trade and economic war. Second, the technology war. Third, the fight for geopolitical influence around the world. Fourth, a capital war competition for investment. And fifth, a clash over culture and values.
Let's take technology. Where does he see things?
He sees the U.S. still having an overall edge, but that lead is definitely shrinking. China's actually ahead in some key areas, like 5G. The U.S. might be ahead in others, like maybe the most advanced AI chips, for now.
How does he measure that? Market caps of companies.
He looks at that, but he cautions it probably underestimates China's strength, because you have huge, powerful state-backed companies or unlisted giants like Huawei that aren't fully captured in stock market figures. He also points to China leading in things like supercomputing, certain AI applications, fintech, and he even suggests there could be major tech breakthroughs happening in China that the West just doesn't know about yet.
And what about the whole issue of intellectual property theft? That's always a big accusation.
It's a constant issue in history, he says, and really hard to stop when powers are competing intensely. He points out it happened between the Dutch and the British, then the British and the Americans as power shifted. When countries are in what feels like a war, whether economic or otherwise, international laws often take a backseat, realistically.
He also mentioned companies like Huawei being a genuine threat.
Yeah, he suggests part of the reason they're seen as a threat is because in some areas their tech might actually be better or cheaper than U.S. alternatives. Which leads him to question things like why Chinese tech giants don't have the same access to the U.S. market that American companies have had in China, suggesting this push towards decoupling in tech is accelerating.
Okay, moving to another flashpoint, Taiwan. Dalio seems really concerned about that one.
Absolutely. He flags Taiwan as possibly the most dangerous immediate risk. He explains that from China's perspective, many believe the U.S. won't allow peaceful reunification, so actions like U.S. arms sales to Taiwan.
Like selling F-16s.
Exactly. Those are seen as moves to prevent reunification, which pushes China to think it needs the military power to potentially force the issue or at least deter U.S. interference.
And China's military is getting much stronger in that region.
Rapidly. So the risk of a miscalculation, some incident sparking a conflict, what he calls a potential fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, is very real. And the big unknown is how the U.S. would actually respond. The consequences of either defending Taiwan or not defending it are just massive, geopolitically.
He compared it to Suez for the British.
Yeah, he drew that parallel. The Suez Crisis in 1956 is often seen by historians as the moment the British Empire's decline became undeniable, and the pound sterling lost its clout. He wonders if Taiwan could play a similar role for the U.S. and the dollar.
Wow. Okay, what about the broader competition for global influence?
Dalio sees a clear trend there. China's influence is growing in many parts of the world, while U.S. influence seems to be, well, relatively shrinking in his view. You can see this shift playing out in international bodies, too, the UN, the IMF, the WHO.
Organizations the U.S. largely shaped after World War II.
Right, and as the U.S. maybe pulls back from some areas, China is stepping in, offering alternative partnerships, different models for development, building its own networks.
And finally, that clash of values. That seems fundamental.
It really is. Dalio points to these deep differences. The U.S. emphasis on individual liberty versus the Chinese cultural focus on respecting authority and the collective good.
He used an example with the NBA, right?
Yeah, that incident where a team manager tweeted support for Hong Kong protesters and the huge backlash in China. It really highlighted the different views on free speech versus causing offense to the collective or interfering in internal affairs. Some cultural differences might be negotiable, he thinks, but others are just deeply ingrained, raising tough questions about whether nations should even try to change each other's core values.
So Dalio uses all this historical analysis. How does it actually feed into his day job, his investment strategies?
Well, he uses this big picture understanding to try and figure out how governments and central banks are likely to act and how those actions will probably affect asset prices, stocks, bonds, currencies, commodities. He stresses how crucial it is to build a really well-diversified portfolio, not just different types of assets, but across different countries and currencies too. And then you need to tactically adjust that portfolio based on what's happening globally, based on these cycles and key indicators he tracks.
He also warns about just looking at our own lifetime experiences, right?
Huge point. He says most investors base their expectations on what they've seen happen in their lifetimes, in their country. That leads to survival bias. You only really study the winners who made it through. You need to look way further back in history and across many different countries to see the full range of what can happen, including the really bad stuff.
And he has a stark reminder about that bad stuff.
He does. He points out that in the 35 years before 1945, so including World War I, the Depression, World War II, a huge amount of wealth was just wiped out or confiscated by governments in most major countries.
It's sobering.
It is. And he worries people now might just assume the generally good times after 1945 will continue indefinitely, without considering these historical patterns of major destruction and upheaval.
Okay, so as we bring this deep dive towards a close, what's Dalio's final takeaway? His overall concluding thoughts on where things might be headed?
Well, to reiterate, he sees the U.S. Great Cycle as being in a pretty tough spot, high debt, relatively low growth expected compared to the past. He highlights the serious internal conflict and the risks that come with it.
Those wealth and values gaps he mentioned.
Yeah, he notes those gaps in the U.S. are very large compared to historical examples in other countries. His overall assessment: the U.S. looks like it's maybe 70% through its typical cycle as the world's dominant power, and history shows that reversing that kind of relative decline is incredibly difficult.
He even mentioned a potential recession soon.
He floated the possibility of a recession around the next U.S. presidential election cycle. And looking externally, he stresses again the rising tensions with China across all those areas we discussed: trade, tech, influence, Taiwan, and the real risk of conflict, maybe over Taiwan or in the South China Sea.
So not exactly a rosy picture.
Not entirely, no. But his final point isn't about predicting the future with certainty. It's about understanding the probabilities based on history, recognizing the risks, and focusing on how to be adaptable, how to navigate the unknowns. Because, probabilities aren't destiny.
Right. So the core message here from Dalio's work, learner, for you, is that history really does give us valuable clues.
Yeah.
It gives us patterns for understanding today and thinking about tomorrow.
Yeah, especially the cyclical nature of nations rising and falling and how economic, society, politics all interact in predictable yet complex ways.
And we've gotten a clearer sense of where Dalio sees the U.S. and China fitting into these massive historical cycles right now. So the final thought for you, learner, is maybe to consider what these historical cycles, these determinants of power we talked about, what might they mean for your own understanding of the world? How might they shape how you think about the future?
Yeah, it's worth exploring Dalio's work more, or other historical analyses. It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Recognizing the power of these long-term historical patterns.
What?
While also acknowledging that our current moment always has unique things about it, too. It's definitely a lot to think about.
It is.
But hopefully, this deep dive has given you a useful framework, a powerful lens for trying to make sense of our complex, always changing world.